Personalization exists in many contexts, from search to shopping to entertainment to news. In this module, we will look at how personalized search in the context of news portals can lead to so-called filter bubbles, or situations where a user might have limited exposure to the sources in the news that they end up consuming as a result of the topics that they're looking for, and various aspects that contribute to personalization. Many organizations and information conduits, ranging from news outlets to information intermediaries like search engines, can censor or manipulate citizens' access to information. These practices can create so-called filter bubbles, whereby the information a user sees is highly controlled by that information intermediary and depends on contexts and factors that may not be immediately apparent to the user. Those might include the user's geographic location or past behavior, such as past search behavior. We used a data set of articles collected using 2 million queries of Google News to study how coverage of a particular topic in terms of the news sources varied across different user profiles and geographies. We saw various evidence suggesting different characteristics of filter bubbles. Among the findings, we found a lack of diversity where 20% of the news sources are responsible for 80% of the article in a user's newsfeed. For some countries, we saw news results from local sources ranked higher than other sources, although that phenomenon varied depending on the country that the user was in. And we also saw cases where some search results returned news stories in some countries, but in other countries returned no results whatsoever. Here's a brief overview of the study process. We used RSS feeds to retrieve articles, extracted text and named entities from those articles, and used those extracted entities to generate queries, which we then fed to Google News under a variety of different profiles and geographies. We then examined the characteristics of the resulting corpus of returned articles for each of those user profiles and geographies. We looked at the diversity of news sources in various countries, the differences in the news sources across those countries, and the differences in search results across those countries. This figure shows how the articles we collected from about 3,800 English news sources over 5 months and 22 countries are distributed across those news sources for any particular country. The majority of English-speaking countries that we studied had fewer than 1,000 news sources, and no country had more than 1,600 distinct news sources. It's interesting to note that the number of distinct news sources a user is likely to see depends a lot on the country where the user is seeking news. For example, news feeds in Israel saw more than 1,500 distinct news sources, whereas news feeds in New Zealand saw only 200 distinct news sources. The figure also shows that many of the articles in any particular country's news feed tend to come from a smaller number of sources. For example, although the US edition of Google News RSS feed incorporated over 1,500 sources across 5 months, fewer than 400 of these sources contributed more than 5 articles to the news feed over that entire 5-month period. We also saw a distinct localization of news sources, as you can see in these tables, although the amount of country-level localization differed depending on the country of origin. For different editions of Google News, each country's top news sources are unique to that country, and the results indicate that different countries see a wide range of both the number of articles and the number of sources over a particular time range. The ratio of the number of articles per source varies from about 130 to 1 for New Zealand and Switzerland. That is, there's significant lack of diversity in the news sources in those countries, whereas in the US, that ratio is about 35 to 1, indicating significantly more diversity. Most countries fall somewhere in between. As you can see from the tables, some of the news sources are highly localized depending on the countries that one is reading news from. For example, the US and the UK see top news sources from their local countries, as do many other countries. It's interesting to note, however, that some countries like Israel and Singapore also have US news sources as top news sources being returned in response to search queries. Interestingly enough, we saw a significant number of queries in many countries that returned empty results in those countries where the same query in another country returned at least one news source, indicating that this portal may be performing some amount of filtering in each of these countries. In summary, we looked at the diversity of sources that users saw in a news portal, Google News, across countries and user profiles, and saw a distinct lack of diversity, some local personalization and bias, as well as cases where the results themselves were filtered completely. It's probably worth exploring this phenomenon further across different types of content, as well as perhaps different news portals as well.